Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt, and this week we'll be focusing on the relationship of spirituality and writing. Our guest, award-winning author and North Carolina Poet Laureate, Joseph Bethanti, will be sharing with us as we talk about his work and thoughts on spirituality and religion. Welcome, Joseph. Thank you for being here today.
I'm glad to be here, Ozzie.
It's an honor.
Oh.
North Carolina Poet Laureate, prodigious output.
Well,
I think at last count, and I may be wrong, 8 books of poetry, 9 now maybe?
Yeah.
You've lost count too.
No, not at all. Not
3
at all.
novels, some nonfiction, a memoir, short stories.
Yes, sir.
It seems to me it's a little rare to find an author who can work so efficiently in several genres.
Yeah, that's kind of been a real fun thing to do, actually. Ozzie is bounce around. I feel myself sometimes telling the same story in the 3 different media, nonfiction, fiction, and then poetry. And different things happen when you move from genre to genre, like that.
Well, now, when we were corresponding about this, you said something that caught my interest. You said that most of your works are spiritual in some way, or have a spiritual component, or there's a spirituality about it. Could you comment on that just a little bit?
Yeah, it's pretty concrete, I think, Ozzie. When I first started trying to be a serious writer, and I had no idea what that was, and I always tell my students, I started out by writing badly, and then I wrote less badly and a little less badly. So when I really first started writing, I, like so many other people, thought that creative writing was literally creative writing, wholly imaginative, wholly made up out of whole cloth. But I didn't have that kind of imagination like a J.R.R. Tolkien or an Isaac Asimov. I could write maybe a sentence or 2 about what it was like to be in outer space and on the sea floor, and then I ran out of gas because I had no earthly idea. I just don't possess that kind of imagination. So I went back into the crypts, into my central store of knowledge, and I found myself square in my childhood in the Catholic Church and Catholic school. I grew up in a now vanished little Italy of Pittsburgh. My dad was a steelworker. My mom was a seamstress. All my grandparents immigrated from Italy in the first part of the 20th century. So we were very much old world Italian Catholics.
Like pre-Vatican II Catholic?
Yeah, because I think Vatican II was 62 or 61, because I was a little kid and remember it all happening under Pope John the 23rd. At any rate, I realized what a rich trove of material that I had, and it all came out of the rhythm of going to church, going to a Catholic school. I was an altar boy, I was a choir boy, I went to Mass every day, then went into Catholic school where I was taught by nuns every day. So I was, even though I wouldn't have said I was consciously paying attention, I was very clearly consciously paying attention. So when I started putting words on the page, I realized that I was very much indebted to Catholicism for my literary storehouse, and then you know.
How so? I mean, is it? I've heard you, or I've read you where you speak about Catholic worship being a very sensory experience, and it seems to me that that's something that Protestantism lacks. That kind of involvement of all the senses. And is that playing into the richness of what you're writing?
I think so, and it starts out because I was a little kid when this all starts out. You know, I start school at 6. Of course, I'd gone to church before then, but I'm in church every single day, and I'm in a church that was built in the middle of the 19th century, so it's regally festooned with this just otherworldly beauty and iconography, idolatry, I might add, the Protestants might call it, but it was wholly fascinating. And it was a sensory onslaught. There was the incense, there were the statues, there were the stained glass windows. There was also the sound, that rather somnolent hum of the old Latin Mass, that dirge like, ooh. So I was hearing that, and I think it's in the rhythm of my writing, and even the proper proper nouns and just that kind of blazing imagery. And then you went into school and we had religion class and we read about the martyrs, and
Right.
I was wholly fascinated with that. In saying it's a kind of spirituality, that might be a stretch, because I wasn't aware of being a spiritual kid. I was made to be spiritual. I had to do things.
Right.
I was in awe of it. I didn't understand it, but it is my rich past. It's also my vocabulary. It's where my language comes from. It's where the stories that still haunt me and travel with me come from, for the most part.
I've wondered if this richness of experience you're talking about has in the rhythms of the worship. Do you think that's any way influenced your preference for poetry?
Yeah, I think it has in some ways. I think the old Latin Mass is in and of itself a kind of
It's beautiful,
long, connected series of poems, and it's important to realize that I was hearing that Mass initially in Latin. So it was a conglomeration of what I found to be beautiful syllables that I didn't clearly understand, so that it was communicating to me on a very deep and visceral level. I knew what was going on, but I couldn't have translated it too. And there was all that pomp. There was also that hush. There was a good bit of fear too, because I don't know if fear is quite the word, but intimidation. Those saints and those angels, and the bloody, bleeding Christ everywhere, and and also the nuns, dressed completely in black, very druidic looking. This mystery, the idea of the body and the blood, and I didn't see it as a metaphor. I believed, like Flannery O'Connor, with all my heart and soul, that really was the body and blood of Jesus. And Flannery herself says, and I paraphrase, that she wasn't somebody who swore often, but I believe she said, "I wouldn't give a damn for the Eucharist if it was a metaphor." So I wholly believed in that too, without really examining it terribly deeply.
Right. But now you're, I think, a member of a Protestant church.
I am, yeah. I very much am. We lived in Statesville for 12 years, and were members of Grace Baptist Church, because it was a liberal church in the community, and now we're members of High Country United Church of Christ here in Boone, because it's kind of the liberal, all-encompassing, I don't know, what I like to think of as Christ-like church,
right.
Welcoming of everyone, regardless. Although I shouldn't set myself up as this big churchgoer either these days. But those are the places that I have belonged to since being a member of a Catholic parish all my life.
Well, let me return to your writing a little bit, and rather than the content of the writing, the discipline of writing. You've intimated in a couple of your pieces, your essays, that writing itself is a kind of spiritual and contemplative discipline for you. Could you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think in one's writing, you go to places that you don't go to consciously, and you think with a kind of laser-like intensity about those things that, again, because you're trying to make something that's not only cogent to you, make sense out of a kind of chaos, but you're trying to make sense out of it for your reader too. So it's contemplative in the sense that you live with it deeply, and you spend time on words, and you examine very deeply your thought process in ways that, thank God, we don't do on a conscious level, minute by minute. Consciousness would be horrifying if we were so introspective all the time. But you're terrifically introspective in private when you're writing. There was an exercise that we were taught to do before we went to confession, the sacrament of penance, and it was it was called examining your conscience. So going very deeply in there and really doing an inventory of all these horrifying things that you had done, even though you were too young to do very much, so you could confess them to the priest. And I see that's a kind of ritual, I think, that that I engage in as well when I write. So it does feel terrifically spiritual, and doubly so sometimes if I'm literally going back inside that experience.
Right. And you have tremendous work habits, I think, with your writing. And I read somewhere that I think that you value work as a kind of spiritual
Yeah.
obligation almost.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is this like strange, guilt-ridden Calvinist zeal.
You're Protestant. You're really Protestant.
I know.
Right?
I'm a
You
Calvinist. I know. Yeah. I discovered at some point in my life that if you don't really put your head down and do things, nothing will happen. You know, and you know, young writers have to learn that the hard way, I think, sometimes. But I was able to kind of learn that when I came to North Carolina in 1976. Finally away from home, wanted to be a writer. How do you do that? Well, you write. That seems logical, but that connection, sometimes it takes a long time to really realize that you have to sit down at the table and churn out pages. Otherwise, young writers often say that they're waiting to be inspired. I write when I'm inspired, but how often are you inspired to do anything? We're never inspired to cut the grass or run a few miles or do anything like that. You know, it's blue collar stuff. So I try to think of writing as kind of a blue collar enterprise, something that you must engage in even when you don't feel like doing it. You know?
But does inspiration play a role? Do you have a
Yeah, it does. Okay. I mean, I hope so. For me, I'm certainly not the first to say this. I know I've heard the poet Robert Lowell say it on a tape, and he might have stole it from somewhere, where that memory is the mother of the muse. And for me, memory is my muse, because so much of my work comes out of memory, past, recollected, reconstructed, reimagined. You know, did it really all happen that way? I don't really know, but that's the psychic truth of it and the emotional truth. So I am inspired by things that I see, but often by things I remember, and just mysterious things that have occurred that I'm still trying to make sense of.
Right. Beyond your writing, your life seems to be infused with a kind of mature spirituality, I'd say.
Well, that's very nice of you to say, Ozzie.
I just reading your biography and such, you have a kind of commitment to service. You worked with Vista, and you met your wife through that work.
Right.
You've worked in prison communities with veterans.
I have.
Is this a kind of outgrowth of that same kind of spirituality,
you know,
obligation of spirituality?
I think there is that sense of obligation, and you could call it guilt even. You know, people often speak of guilt in terrifically pejorative ways, but when guilt motivates me often. You know, if I feel like if I feel guilty because I have more than someone else, you know, then maybe I should give part of my inventory to those people. But you know, when I became a Vista volunteer, and that was happenstance, that was an accident. I was sent to Vista because I had no real skills. I just had gotten out of graduate school with a degree in English, so I was termed a generalist. So I wasn't a carpenter, I wasn't an electrician, a nurse, a physician. I was a generalist. So they dumped all the generalists into prisons. But that was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it really did teach me that there is an entire community of mercy out there, folks who do things for people who can't do things for themselves. And I think once immersed in that world, it's hard to then extricate oneself.
Right.
I would have never gotten into prison work, but now that I know prisons exist, that there's that community of maybe 2.5 million people that we incarcerate, more people than anywhere else in the whole wide world. You know, I think about them. They orbit me a little bit, and you know, the vets' work was similar. You know, people go to war so other people can stay home. And I have this odd sort of epistemological, ontological equation in my head that you know, people who go to prison so that I don't have to be in prison, and the people who are homeless are taken my place there. I really do believe that. I don't think it's because of some spiritual deformity on their part that they ended up in these straits, or some, lofty spiritual bearing on my part that has allowed me to lead such a privileged life. So I think that service is really important. And the truth of the matter is, those prisoners, those veterans, those battered women, all the people I've been privileged to be around have taught me so much more than I've taught them.
Right.
I think,
You said something that your Vista work was almost an accident, which reminds me of, in some ways, of a commencement address you gave here a couple of years ago, which is still my favorite commencement address of all time. But you meditated on Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken.
Right.
And there's a phrase there, I think it's the way on to way.
Yeah, way leads on to way.
The way leads on to way, which suggests to me that this life thing that we're in is a kind of pilgrimage or journey.
Yeah, it really is. I was afraid I might get lynched for bringing up that poem that probably every commencement speaker in the world brings up,
but you did something different with it.
Yeah, I tried to.
Yeah,
I tried to. The difference, we don't know what difference might be, and that we are faced with crossroads, and sometimes we don't know where we're going. I don't want to get too precious and say that there's a divine plan for us and all of that. But happenstance, accident, there's a kind of mysticism in there, I think, that I would land in North Carolina, that I so came to love, that I would, meet my wife. We'll be married 40 years in a few days. That all of that happened because I threw my name in the hat, because I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life.
Right.
And again, I did not necessarily want to be a do-gooder, but I wanted to do good, if that makes any sense. Sure. So that was the best thing I ever did. And the other, go to Vista with my brand new education, and with my family looking at me like I had completely lost my mind, that I was leaving to go 500 miles away to make $2,000 a year working with prison inmates. And I had just gotten this degree, and I was like every other kid on the block. I was supposed to be a doctor or a lawyer. Those were kind of your two options.
Yeah. Well, thank goodness you're a writer.
Well,
I think you found your purpose.
Well, that was something, wholly unexpected too. I mean, I was aiming for that, but it's kind of like, aiming to play shortstop for the Dodgers or something like that too.
Well, let me ask you about this book here, your memoir. So we talked a little bit about your poetry, but half of what I say is meaningless.
Right.
A collection of essays, which is a memoir of sorts.
Yeah.
And I read the lead essay, which shares the title of the book, and in that essay, you're struggling with the morality of war.
Right.
At a coming of age period in your life, college age, and you're introduced to philosophical existentialism. How did that come together to create a worldview? My goodness.
It was 1972. I was in the very last Vietnam draft lottery. Vietnam War was terrifically unpopular among the people I had aligned myself with, maybe philosophically, but I also am always quick to point out that I was not politically astute. I wasn't a war protester. I did by that time think that war was bad, that Vietnam wasn't a good idea. I did not want to go to war. And in the piece, I talk about going to the Friends Peace Center in Pittsburgh and seeing if I could be a conscientious objector. And I quickly found out that I could not be, because I did not have those vested beliefs in peace and nonviolence that I really thought I had. So it was time to completely reevaluate my identity in some ways, and here grace of God comes in, as it does so often. You know, the war wound down, the draft was eliminated. I was off the hook through no intervention of my own. You know, I was just kind of spared. So out of that comes my work with vets in so many ways, you know, because that was kind of my war, the Vietnam War, and I still feel like it is. And so that was a kind of way to serve, but nothing like the real service that those guys did in combat.
Well, on that grace of God moment, perhaps, we could end with you reading a poem from your latest collection of poetry.
That'd be great.
The 13th Sunday after Pentecost. There's one in here entitled Holy God.
I would love to read that. Not at all. Not at all.
I'm struck, too, by the titles of your poetry collections. Many of them have religious titles, and this is one of those.
I know that really outs me.
It does, yeah, it really does.
I know. So this poem's called Holy God. You know, I hope it's self-explanatory. It's when I was a little kid, I had to go to Mass every day, and I sang in the choir, which I loved. And it was a very Italian parish, and we had this gorgeous, blonde, blue-eyed organist that I was only 6, but I fell wildly in love with her. So this is 1959 too, apparently. Holy God. Suspended stories above the nave, Saints Peter and Paul's Gothic choir loft took 1,000 trees to carve. Its sad rose window stared at Lorimer Avenue. Mammoth zinc organ pipes fluted the walls. Marooned in our Italian parish, Miss Clare, the blonde Irish organist, spun pale hands across the keys, pumped the pedals, closed her blue eyes, and signaled the dire prelude to Holy God. The choir loft heaved, heavy with the organ's engine. 6 years old, robed and surpliced, clutching a Gregorian missal, I took my cues from her mouth, as if mine on hers, the first time I hallucinated in church. Jesus stirred on his altar cross, releasing me from my body, and I realized as I floated over the congregation how poorly words serve longing. It was the Feast of the Epiphany, 1959. My father was on strike from the steel mill. I peered down, and there he was, pushing along the pews, a long-handled reed alms basket, working his way through the north and south transepts, then the nave, row upon row, down the long stone aisle until the narthex, where the ushers gathered after offertory to count the money. Sun stole through the stained glass, superimposing in a blast of bloody light the communion of saints on the chancel walls, and for an instant I was blinded. Then I was back in the choir loft with the other choir boys, waiting for Miss Clare's eyes to open, that look of ecstasy she flashed me before they closed again, and she began to sing.
That's beautiful.
Thank you,
Great
Ozzie.
way
Thank
to
you.
end our program.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My
Joseph.
pleasure.
I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us on Religion and Life, brought to you by App TV. I want to thank my guest, Joseph Pathanti, for stopping by this week. And on the next episode of Religion and Life, we'll be discussing the Book of Mormon with Dr. Grant Hardy. We hope you join us then. Until next time, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.